Welcome, my friends. I'm D, a they, them. Today, we have a double dose of knowledge for you. We are going to talk about how to beat surfer decks and how to snap in general, and then how to snap against surfer decks specifically. I hope you enjoy. Just before we get started here, I do want to do the call to action because it helps with my metrics, and I hate that it helps, but it does. If you find my content elucidating, enlightening, or enriching, please subscribe. It is the best way for me to know what is resonating with people. If you are the first subscriber, the first new subscriber when this video goes live, and you comment like, hey, I subscribed, I will give you a personalized shout out in the next video. That's the deal. If you don't say anything, then I'll take that to mean you don't want your name read out in case this channel ever blows up and like 100,000 people are like, hey, who's that weird person that D shouted out that one time? Totally understand. All right, so why do we care about beating a surfer? like why specifically? So I used to do these videos, how to beat X deck, right? Like a big streamer or YouTuber would put out a deck list that would be like, here's the deck list for Zabu or whatever. And it felt kind of pointed for me to be like, here's how to beat Jeff Hoogland exactly. So, like, I'm not doing that anymore. Very recently, Regis Kilman put out, like, a really neat video on, like, how to play a She-Hulk magic deck. So, I still think that is true, that when huge content creators put out these videos, you're going to see those decks more. But I'm going to refrain from trying to just make videos on how to counter those exact decks. So that leads us back to the question, like, why are we trying to beat Surfer? And the answer is that the meta breakdown came out recently, and Sarah Surfer is one of the top decks, and you've seen how good Mr. Negative Surfer is, and Zabu Surfer is really popular. So right now, at least, unless they're probably going to have to nerf Surfer to change any of this, or going forward, this info will stay relevant for quite a while. But for right now, there's just a lot of Surfer decks. And I think that a lot of my audience probably wants to know how to beat those decks. So I'm making this video. All right. So the first thing that we have to talk about is that, like, you have to identify that you are actually playing against a surfer deck. And, like, how do you do that? Well, unfortunately, until turn 5, if they drop Sarah, it's kind of hard to tell, but some tells are Sunspot and Domino are fairly popular in surfer decks because they're so heavy on 3-drops that Domino guarantees them a 2-drop. Because it's just, you always draw it on 2 and never before. And Sunspot, because they're going like a 3-drop on 3, a 3-drop on 4, a 3-drop on 5, they floated so much energy that Sunspot can get really big. That's assuming they don't see their Sarah, which we're hoping they don't. But a lot of them will play Sunspot. A lot of them will play Domino. Other than that, it's just understanding that they've played a lot of 3-drops. I don't usually see people playing like quite so many 3-drops as this person. But the earlier you can identify it, the better off you are, because we're going to go into how to snap later. That's the second half of the video, or however long it ends up being. So identifying early is the big one, right? So how do you beat it? If say you do correctly identify it early on, well, like, how do you beat it? Oh, Brood also. Like, Brood is a very big one. Brood is a good card, but it's incredibly good in the Surfer decks. So, like, how do I actually beat the stupid deck? I can identify it 100 out of 100 times, but how do I actually beat it? So, there's a couple ways. If you are playing a leader deck, so I already outlined sort of some decks the other day that you might get into if you were early in Pool 3. One of the ones that I really recommend is Leader, unfortunately, because Leader is a villain-ass card, as we've covered. but it's just really good, and it makes a deck archetype kind of on its own. So, Leader in general is very bad against the Surfer deck, but you can actually win, even though that's usually a bad matchup. And how you do that is very interesting. Well, either you leech, because then they can't Surfer, or you want to actually be behind. And the trick to this is that if they play out their stuff first, what happens is, okay, so they go like Sarah, you still have to be ahead in one lane. It's a fairly complex set of circumstances, like to quantify in your head, but it's actually not hard to pull off in game. And we're going to get into why this is a really good like cube rate on this. We'll get into that in the second half as well. So you have to be ahead in one lane. It has to be the lane where they have cast Sarah, and you have to have more 3-drops than they do in that lane, right? And then all of the other lanes either have to be kind of full, or you have to have some 3-drops there, or they have to be empty and it's where you're putting Leader, right? And then what happens is on 6, their effects go off first. So they summon, we'll say they like summon Maximus, summon like Juggernaut, whatever, some random 3-drop, and then Surfer. And their Maximus and their Juggernaut and then their Broods all get +3, right? And then yours go off, and you copy the bonus stats on those cards, and then your Surfer goes off and puts more bonus stats on and wins you back the lanes that you were losing with interest. And that's really, really interesting that it works that way, but it does. So like I say, it's fairly complex, like, to try to think about, but once you get a hang of it, it's actually really easy to see whether or not you're going to win. In vague generalities. Things, of course, can always go wrong. Like, that's the nature of the game. Your opponent might read that you're on this and understand, but in general, they don't really read it. And there's a lot of cube advantage to be gained by thinking about it like that. Okay. We have the other deck that a lot of people resonate with on this channel is the Deathwave deck. And that one's like pretty hard. You don't run a lot of 3-drops, so you can't take advantage of, it's basically just Wave and Deathlock. So you can't take advantage of like leadering as well as you can with the other deck. But you can assess the situation, and if you wave them on 5 and they don't Sarah on 5, you're usually in a really good spot. If you're not in a good spot, you at least are very knowledgeable about how bad a spot you're in and can make a much better assessment, right? Like, you can understand whether or not you could beat a random 3-drop that your opponent might play with your, like, Death and Leader or Death and Doom, right? And so, it's maybe not advisable, well, again, getting into the cube stuff later, it might not be advisable to snap in that situation, but it is much more readable to your human mortal brain. And that's like a very important part of beating Surfer, is being able to understand what their power breakdown is going to look like on the final turn. So you wave on 5, you see if they Sarah, and you can kind of make your assessment pretty easily based on those circumstances. Then we've got like sort of generic tech. I wouldn't recommend, I know this says anti-Surfer tech, and we actually covered 2 cards that are in the Surfer deck. I wouldn't recommend running this all as one deck to try to beat Surfer. This is just some tech cards. So Cosmo is kind of always good. It's unfortunate how good Cosmo is. It's especially good in the Wong variant, so the sort of either negative Surfer or Zabu Surfer. Cosmo can really get them. It's especially good if they brood into one lane, because that usually is all they want to commit to that lane, and it makes it easier to try to predict where they're going to try to Surfer. Obviously, Wong makes it incredibly easy to predict where they're going to want to Surfer, but if they're just playing the strictly 3-drop kind of Surfer deck, you kind of want them to brood so that it reduces your chances to a 50-50, and honestly, it might even be better odds than that. Like, it can come down to not really a guessing game, depending on where they put their cards before turn 6. Juggernaut is more for the, again, better in the Wong variant, because you need to get them on that turn that they're trying to Surfer with Juggernaut. So you need to be able to read that they're going to Surfer here and push them out of it and have that actually matter. So that's like a little more generic. Polaris isn't actually Polaris, it's Arrow. Arrow is just really a disruptive element and can, again, like kind of fill those lanes where they're trying to do a bunch of stuff. Or fill any lane and make it really easy to guess where to put the Cosmo down, right? Because if they already brooded and then they filled another lane, you kind of know where the Cosmo's got to go to get them. And then sort of the ultimate tech is either Sandman or Leech. Sandman just stops them in their tracks. Usually a Sandman even on 5 is good enough, especially if they Sarah, because they're really jonesing for that big 6, and they might still win. But again, it narrows down, a Sandman narrows down the possibilities to ones that you can understand better, right? Reducing the math, simplifying the math is a big part of winning any game of Marvel Snap, but especially the Surfer games. Okay. And that goes along with the next point, which is being able to identify their best plays. Like, if you want to win, you really have to, I mean, you got to think about what their best 3 drops are, assuming they Sarah'd. Usually one of them is Surfer, and then it's like usually Maximus is the next best one. It can be Wolfsbane, which is just kind of another Maximus. But you really have to watch out for, like, Juggernaut and Killmonger are kind of the big ones that might get you and have gotten me a lot of times, and I've had to learn a lot to even make this video. So being able to identify their best plays, and we're going to loop back to this again for snapping, is maybe not how you beat them, but it's how you lose the least amount of cubes. And I say this a lot, but like winning 8 cubes and losing 1 cube are just as good as one another in a lot of ways. It means you made the most out of your good situation and you made the most out of your bad situation. So don't worry that you lose some amount of the times, even though you read that they were on Surfer and you played your disruption and whatever. If you understand what their best play is and you're like, well, they just snapped on 6 and like, even though I disrupted them, I think I'm gonna lose. Yes, fine, just retreat. You got it. Like losing 1 cube is fine. How many times have you seen me? The reason I'm doing this video, in fact, if you watched yesterday's video, is because I lost 20 cubes in that video and I'm trying to rebuild not on stream. So I'm doing this video instead while I play privately. It's going really well. Thanks for asking. And then the final tip to beating the Surfer deck is identifying their worst lane and free rolling, quote unquote. So again, this is also applies to like a lot of this game, is understanding where your opponent is trying to play to, because in general they cannot play to all 3 lanes. It's kind of why Arrow is so good, is that Arrow forces your opponent to fight you in a lane that they might not have wanted to. Like, you're already way ahead and their turn 5 is now stuck in that lane. You know, I'm not stuck in here with you, you're stuck in here, whatever. So I just lost my train of thought. Okay, so identifying what lane they're trying not to fight over and winning it with the minimal amount of power, and then just fighting over another lane that you can beat even if they go like Maximus Surfer, is going to win you some cubes. And it's really hard to figure that out. And it's also that like people play differently. Like some people are like, well, I'll just try to win the 2 that I'm already ahead in by the most. And some people are like, I'll try to win back the lane that I'm behind in and then hyper win this other lane. And again, it's like psychology, but I'm not getting into that. I don't understand psychology, and I really love psychology, but I don't know it enough to try to make any claims about when it's better to do what. But you'll get a feel for it. And free rolling a lane I've talked about it before. It's why Mr. Fantastic has quite a bit of utility. Why even like Squirrel Girl can have some utility, because putting like the minimal amount of power in a lane and forcing your opponent to be like, fine, I'll play a card there, can win you games on its own. It's great. So that's how to beat Surfer in sort of generalities. We're going to get into how to snap against Surfer, but we're going to talk about how to snap in general first, just in case you're someone who hasn't really thought of like put any like, you know, intellectual effort into this yet. Like you haven't tried to think about how snapping interacts with gameplay. So we're going to cover it in a general sense, and then we'll get into how to snap against Surfer, because there's a lot more to be gained by learning how to snap against Surfer than learning how to tech against Surfer, I think is how I want to say that. So, in general, you snap right before your best play. So again, if you watch the Deathwave deck, you would snap on turn 5 before you reveal Wave, if you have Death and a big play in hand. And the reason for that is that your opponent sees maybe what you're doing up till that point, but thinks they can beat it, and then Wave can really disrupt that that sense of, oh, I can win. And you at that point kind of know you're going to win. Again, like, unless you get Cosmo'd back, and you might have to retreat on 2 cubes instead of 1. But in general, you snap right before your best play, not right after. Because once you've made your best play, your opponent has a really easy time identifying their position, which we talked about in How to Beat Surfer, right? Your opponent goes, okay, well, I know where I stand. I know what I can do, and it's really easy for me to read what my opponent's about to do. Can I just beat that, or can I just not? So sometimes you will snap on a good location reveal, and I was really downplaying this, or like not realizing it in the past. But the amount of times my opponents have done it, where a location flips up that's like good for them, like DC. Neither of us has played anything yet, and Washington DC flips up, and my opponent snaps. It's like, okay, well, I know exactly what they're on, but I don't think I can beat it if DC flipped up. It's just an extra Patriot buff. Like, I can't fight for DC, and they can win it with very few cards, and I don't know that I can beat whatever else they're doing, right? If I don't have like an Enchantress in my deck. So I've noticed that, especially with the location as it is right now. If I have like all the pieces to my combo for Deathwave, and the feature location, the Collapse Mine, flips up, I'm just snapping. We got 8 destroys just on that location. My death costs 1 even without Wave, and I'm gonna get some amount of value just snapping, and it's been working because it's just a really good location for what that deck is doing. And it doesn't work all the time, but it works more of the time than it doesn't, right? I think that makes sense. Okay. And like I said, I used to not do that. I'm getting better at snapping earlier on good location reveals, especially. Snap on, oh, here we go. Snap, I meant to pull this deck up before. Snap, if you're playing like a very disruptive deck, or a synergistic deck, and you have you have all the pieces, in quotes, you can snap on opening hands. Like, if you're playing a disruptive sort of Leech Leader deck, and you're like Iceman into Scorpion, and you already have some other pieces going on, snap it. Like, you're gonna, you know, that's what your deck is doing, and you are getting out early and doing the thing. Like, you go for the early cubes. You're gonna force your opponent out some amount of the time. When you Iceman, you snap on one, and then you Iceman, and you hit the card that they need to like play fairly early to get their thing going, or you hit their Sarah, and they're just like, well, guess I'll die. Psylocke negative. Psylocke 2 into -3. I'll snap that. Same with the Psylocke Sandman if I'm playing the Quicksand deck. I don't really know enough about Leech Leader specifically to know if you snap having both of those in your opening hand, but you know what I'm getting at, right? Like, especially if you're playing a synergistic deck and you have all the synergy, go for the early snap some of the time. And you're just gonna, like, if your opponent's kind of sitting there with a dirtily hand of like, well, if I draw the right things or whatever, you're gonna force them out, and you're not losing any value. Your deck is doing the maximum that it can do, and you're not losing anything for trying, right? You're losing 1 cube. Sometimes not to snap, because that's also just as important. Do not try to snap to bluff your opponent. Don't do it. Don't. I know you think you're being really big brained. I feel like most of my 8 cube wins are my opponent trying to snap to bluff me and then just not having it, and like having too much ego to retreat afterwards. I don't know. Or I don't know. Don't try to snap to bluff. Most players are not even paying enough attention to read that you're bluffing. They're just gonna figure like, oh yeah, I have a pretty good hand, I'll snap back, sure. And then you're like, well, I'm dead. And then the traditional wisdom is not to snap on turn 6, because again, at this point, everyone can kind of identify where they stand within the game, and what the odds are of everyone having every different combination of cards. And in general, if you're gonna win, snapping on 6 costs you a cube, because they were just gonna be like, maybe I'll play it out, maybe this is good enough, I'm not really sure. And you would have gotten 2 cubes by having like a guaranteed win, right? Like a turn 6 double death off Moon Girl or something. And you're like, I know I can beat whatever they're about to put down. But if you snap, they'll just retreat, because they know you're going to beat it too if you're snapping. I still wouldn't say, I would still say don't try to bluff it, even in that scenario. But in general, don't snap on 6. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in the Against Surfer, which we're coming up on. So these are sort of specific scenarios that you're going to come up against in snapping against the Surfer deck, right? So a really good one is if you can read where you're going to have to put Cosmo down to beat them. And usually that comes in the form of them playing Brood into a lane and then either filling it or you forcing a card into that lane, right? Through arrow or whatever. But also sometimes them just putting Brood down means they're not going to Surfer that lane. Like, I just very rarely see it. So Brood already kind of narrows down their Surfer to a 50-50, but it can get better than that for you, like, based on other criteria. Going off of that, you can snap on multiple Cosmo effects. Either if they play a Cosmo and you also have one, if there's a cloning vat, or if there's a Nowhere, which is a location that does the Cosmo thing. Those are really good. Like again, they really rely on that Surfer buff. Their cards aren't super impactful otherwise, and so being able to shut down multiple lanes, or even all lanes, assuming you don't need on reveals to win, you can snap. You can preemptively snap, and probably should, as soon as you see that you can, if they drop a Cosmo and you have a Cosmo, snap before you reveal that you've also got a Cosmo and that they just don't have anywhere to on reveal anymore. You can probably snap on them Sarahing and you leeching, right? And you might want to even preemptive this one right before turn 5. Again, I'm not as sure because I don't do Leech Leader that often, but I assume it's like Wave, where right before you reveal on turn 5 your Leech, you can snap it if you have the leader as well. Like I said, snap the Psylocke into Sandman. That usually is an instant retreat anyway. And then the time where it is actually safe to snap on 6 in general is that really difficult setup. That's like the setup I was talking about before with leader. That's hard to quantify in your mind, but actually kind of easy to read on the board, where you have more 3-drops than them in a certain lane, right? Like you have a Deathlock or a Killmonger in a lane where they only have a Sarah, and then you will have another lane that's empty, because a pretty common thing, right, is for them to have like Brood, 3 Broods in one lane, a 3-drop in another lane, and like Sarah in the third lane, right? Kind of by turn 5, because they went like 3, 4, 5 in that order. And they're planning on doing turn 6, 2 3-drops plus a Surfer. And so like, okay, so you give up the Brood lane. They have a 3-drop in the center lane, right? They have whatever, Killmonger. And you have Deathlock, right? And then they have Sarah in the right lane, but you have Killmonger. If you leader the left, you... if you leader the left and they go for the Surfer, you win. Because you will get more buffs in whatever lane. You will get as many or more power in both of the other 2 lanes. And you won't accidentally fill them because your leader is in the lane that you're giving up to the Brood. Okay, that's, again, really difficult to, like, quantify. But it's really easy to identify once you're playing it. And so if you have that situation set up, it's actually really safe to snap. Oh, also, that's assuming they're revealing first. So that's, right? In the situation I set up, they would be, because they'd be ahead on the Sarah lane and ahead on the Brood lane. So if that's all in place, you can snap on 6, and in fact, you probably should. Because what's going to happen is that they're going to snap back and be like, there's no way they can beat me. I'm doing all this stuff on turn 6. What are they gonna do? Death? And then you get 8 cubes, and it's really good. So that's all to say that the best time to snap is right before your opponent knows that they're losing. But that's much harder to learn than it is to say. So I hope that this was enjoyable. It is, again, quite the info dump. We did no gameplay, and we did 27 minutes of me talking at you with no visuals on screen besides whatever I add to it for the like and subscribe visuals. But I hope that all of that was fun to listen to. Again, elucidating, enlightening, or enriching. And I thank you so much for the gift of your time. I hope you have a great day.